I turned to the Lord and said, God, I am scared. I'm not going to live through this night. I'm terrified. I don't want to go to hell. My life is a wreck. I feel like there's no hope for me. And at that point, a light didn't shine out of heaven. I did not hear an audible voice, but I really do believe I sensed the presence of God and His Spirit speaking to me.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled. Real people telling true stories about God's compelling love working in their lives. I'll tell you more about Compelled and share a sneak glimpse of our next episode and tell you how to win a free DVD and book from today's guest right after our story. We hope that you enjoy hearing the story of Phillip Telfer, who as a young man was driven to a point of such hopelessness and despair that he planned his own suicide. Yet at that very moment, God met him and saved him. Today, Phillip serves as the teaching pastor at Living Water Fellowship in Bulverde, Texas. He's the founder of Media Talk 101 and the founder and director of the Christian Worldview Film Festival. We hope you enjoy. Well, Phillip, it is good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Compelled. So, Phillip, I've known you for probably I've known you better for like the last 4 or 5 years, but I actually met you, I want to say back in 2006 or 7, probably at a film festival, somewhere way back there. Can you briefly, tell us a little about your childhood and just your early years growing up?
Yes. Well, I am very grateful to have been raised in a Christian home. And so in a small rural town in the middle of the state of Oregon. And my mom and dad, they took us to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and every Baptist business meeting. So
Nice.
we were, we were in church all the time. And I look back and I'm so grateful for them making that a priority. Now, having said that, going to church doesn't make you a Christian. I was the middle of 3 boys, and for the most part, we had a pretty stable household. But Phillip, the middle boy, just seemed to be, marching to the beat of a different drummer.
Really?
And I really struggled. I think when I was very young, just fitting in school. I went to school, and the things my friends were teaching me, the things I was learning in media and entertainment, which ran counter to what I was learning in church and in my home. To me, those things felt like they were worth more and worth pursuing.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was missing out if I didn't have those things.
Yeah.
So I made a conscious choice. Like, I'm choosing to follow my path rather than to follow God. And I was deceived in thinking that I could somehow, live in both worlds and be okay. And by the time I reached high school and I was getting involved in drugs and alcohol and continuing on my rebellious streak, I was also becoming more depressed and suicidal.
Wow.
And from the time I was a freshman in high school to the time I was a senior, struggled with thinking about suicide, dreaming about it, plotting it. And my heart was very dark, and part of that was due to drugs. Part of that was due to my rebellion. Obviously, just my distance from having a real relationship with God. And then also I was dabbling in the occult. So you put all those things together, and it just makes for a bad mix.
Wow.
And so my heart was very darkened, very depressed. But the one thing that really helped me during those years was that basic fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen to me if I end my own life. I was afraid of not going to heaven.
Yeah.
Well, what happened was it all came to a crux literally in my senior year of high school. There were several things that had gone on where I had a very bad week, very depressed. Looking back now, maybe they weren't so major, but when you're 17 years old, they were major. And I got so depressed and I was so deceived, and I just didn't want to live anymore. I was afraid of dying for many years, and that's what kept me from committing suicide. But I'd become very afraid of living. So I determined that night, it was in December of 1989, that I would not live through the night. And that's a very scary place to be in, to start thinking about how you're going to end your life. Am I going to leave a note? And something happened, though. I said, I'm so afraid of going to hell for the kind of life I've been living and for killing myself, that I'm going to pray and ask God to forgive me ahead of time for what I'm about to do. The interesting thing was it caused me to turn my heart to the Lord
Yeah.
in prayer. So even though what I intended to do in that prayer was wrong, what came out of that prayer was completely different in what I needed. Basically, as I turned to the Lord and said, God, I am scared. I'm not going to live through this night. I'm terrified. I don't want to go to hell. My life is a wreck. I feel like there's no hope for me. I have no future. I have my present is messed up. I got all these regrets in the past, and I'm scared, and I feel like there's no hope. And at that point, a light didn't shine out of heaven. I did not hear an audible voice, but I really do believe I sensed the presence of God and His Spirit speaking to me and essentially telling me something I'd heard preached growing up many times. It just didn't sink in. And it was basically, Philip, the life that you want to live, that you really long for, can't be found in the way you're going. You're going to have to let that go and lose your life and come follow me. And you'll find the life that you're longing for.
Yeah.
And Jesus said that. He said, if you wish to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. But I just didn't. That night, it was a revelation. And it just made complete sense to me. Wait a minute. I'm ready to die tonight. I'm ready to end my existence. Phillip Telfer is no longer going to exist. Why don't I just end it this way? Why don't I just say goodbye to Phillip Telfer, hello to following the Lord, and trust that He's got a life for me that's worth living? So I tell people, I did commit suicide, but it was a spiritual suicide. And the Philip that came out of that room the next morning was not the same Philip that went into the room that night. And when I sensed this tremendous freedom by turning my heart to the Lord and essentially repenting and saying, I want to follow you. I want to give my life to you. I'm done with this other life. I made a prayer that I reflect upon quite a bit, and I said, God, I have one request, though, if it's okay for me to put a word in for myself here.
Yeah.
Since I'm dying tonight, and my life is going to be different from here on, would you put me to work? Would you give me something to do? Would you make me useful? And I didn't have all the theological terminology. I've just make me useful for your sake, and I'll be glad to serve you. And that's really where it all began. And I'm grateful. He has been very faithful to give me a lot of things to do in His kingdom.
That's really encouraging to hear. This is a really unique testimony. Like I've heard other people's testimonies that came from similar maybe circumstances surrounding them, but I've never heard one before where they were saying I was going to commit suicide, and then as I was praying just before committing suicide, God changed my heart right then, and that's just really astounding. What happened the very next day, when you walked out? Did you just...
Well, I had to get up and go to school.
Yeah. I mean, did your friends at school hey, what's different? Or was it more of a gradual change? Or
it was. There wasn't time to be too gradual because I was now entering into my last season of high school. This was December, and I only had a few months left before I'd graduate, and so I went all in, for the Lord.
Yeah.
And I made it very bold that I was no longer living for myself, that I was going to live for Jesus. And a couple things happened. One was I lost a lot of friends. A lot of friends felt like I was a sellout, that I'd given in to the pressure of because they knew my family situation. They knew that I was in a Christian home. But then some of my friends actually came to the Lord. Not many of them, but some of them began to turn to the Lord, and I made new friends. I began to find an affinity with people I previously didn't have an affinity with. And a lot of neat things started happening. Also, during that time, I was involved in I was a freestyle BMXer during those years.
Okay.
I got involved in it when I was a freshman in high school. It was a relatively new sport, doing tricks on a 20-inch BMX bike. That scene does put you kind of in the groove of the skateboarding scene as well, and the punk rock scene. Mm-hmm. So that was my direction. Well, culturally during that time, especially in the punk rock scene, you had a jacket, that you would decorate. You'd put spikes, studs, chains, patches. Yeah. But the back of the jacket was for your political or cause statement.
Interesting.
And I remember I'd recently bought a brand new jacket, and before I got saved, I was contemplating, what am I going to put? What's my cause?
Yeah.
am I going to put on the back of this jacket? And I struggled, so I didn't do anything. And I was also an artist, so I did airbrushing, and so it was no big deal. I could really decorate the back of my jacket. It's going to be cool.
Yeah.
And then I got saved before I put anything on the back of that jacket. And so I said, what am I going to put on there now? So I thought about it, and early on, I painted a big old cross with the words "Jesus saves" on the back of my jacket,
Wow.
which is pretty extreme. This is public school. Kids already know me as Phillip, the BMX guy.
Yeah.
So that was a very bold statement, and I wanted to make sure that my faith was very evident. I didn't want to be ashamed of Christ.
Yeah.
I was very convicted about that. I'm like, I don't want to be, hanging my head as a Christian. I want to be bold. He saved my life. I'm going to proclaim him.
That is such a cool story. And thanks, by the way, for sharing just like how God used you, like from an early age, like right after being saved, essentially, just like how you began like sharing your faith, and then how God used that to touch other people's lives. That's really encouraging.
Well, for me, it's very unique. I wish more people could have a similar kind of experience. Not that they would be driven to the point of suicide, but that they would truly understand what it means to not belong to themselves anymore.
Yeah.
And I truly came to that place. I don't belong to me. I was going to be dead and gone. So my life doesn't exist anymore. It only exists for the Lord. So I want to, I want to follow him. I had wanted to become an artist. I wanted to go to school. I wanted to go to the Seattle Art Institute. And I didn't think that would necessarily change, except about 2 weeks after I gave my heart to the Lord, I began to sense a strong call into ministry, which was something I never imagined in my life. And it scared me.
Yeah.
I was like, ministry, missions, serving the Lord, whatever, I don't even know what that means or what that looks like. And for about 2 weeks, I wrestled with it, but it really kept coming back to me like it has now for the last 28 years of my life. Phillip, you don't belong to yourself. You died. You're a new person. You gave your life to the Lord. It belongs to Him. Through prayer and through circumstances, I felt a strong calling to serve God in Chicago.
In Chicago, even though you were grown up in Oregon.
I grew up in Oregon, never been to Chicago before.
Never been to Chicago your entire life, yet you felt like...
I really believed God was calling me to Chicago. Now, I was praying about it, and the interesting thing was, I was bold enough to talk to my youth pastor at the time, who, I started going regularly to a youth group, and so that he knew about my new conversion to Christ and my new life, and then I felt called into ministry. I shared that with him, and then when I told him, I said, I really feel God's calling me to Chicago. And at first he was like, oh, okay, well, that's nice. But then maybe a week later, he came to me and he said, Phillip, did you sign up for our spring camp? And I said, yeah, I'm all signed up, ready to go. He said, well, it's exciting. Our guest speaker this year is from Chicago.
Okay.
And so make sure you meet with him and talk to him, and which I did. And I met this man. His name was Dean, and he was so excited about me feeling called to Chicago. And he told me about this program called Chicago Outreach, which was a summer program. And he says, I'm going to send you the information for it, the application, fill it out, send it in. You'll work with a church for the summer as an intern, helping to establish outreaches for youth groups that come into the city during the summer. He says, it'll be great. You'll get a good overview of the city. So I did that. I signed up for Chicago Outreach. Unfortunately, I never heard anything back from them.
Oh.
So I had the application filled out. I had my youth pastor sign it, my parents sign it, sent it in. Never heard anything back from them. I just went anyway.
You just went anyway?
I just went. As soon as I graduated from high school, I packed the few belongings I had in my little 1976 Volkswagen Rabbit, put my bike on the back, and I headed to Chicago.
And you didn't know what church you were going to go to?
I didn't have any. I had one contact. I had met another ministry where someone told me they had a brother that was a pastor in Chicago. So they jotted down his number and said, hey, here, in case you ever want to look him up. I had tucked that into my Bible, almost forgot about it. But literally, when I showed up in Chicago, I called and talked to the secretary, explained it the best I could. I'm just arrived in town, and I'm hoping to participate in something called Chicago Outreach, but I don't know anything about it. They said, we're sorry, we don't have any information, but here's another number you could call. And that happened for probably 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
Where I got another number to call, and they didn't know anything about it. Finally, I think the 3rd or 4th number, someone said, call us back, and hopefully we'll have some information for you. And they said, here's a number for someone that has something to do with Chicago Outreach. And it happened to be Teen Challenge.
Teen Challenge.
So Teen Challenge was or the director of Teen Challenge at the time was also involved in directing Chicago Outreach. And so I spent my first night in Chicago at Teen Challenge in Humboldt Park, Chicago.
Wow.
Very rough neighborhood for those who know Chicago.
And were you spending the night with the Teen Challenge participants?
I was.
Like in the same dormitory
Yep,
with
that's right.
people that were going through rehab and whatever else?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That was my start. And the next day I met the director. His name was Rich. And he was not, at the time, very enthusiastic about me just showing up in Chicago.
Had they received your application?
Apparently not. So when we met in his office, and of course you have to understand, they run a tight ship at Teen Challenge, and they've got to.
Yeah.
And if I could describe what I looked like at the time, the best I could tell you is I had long curly hair past my shoulders. I had my black jacket, which had the spikes, the studs, the chains. Of course, the Jesus Saves on the back.
Yeah.
I wore a 146 stud Harley belt.
Nice.
Skate pants, and I had these stupid-looking leather moccasins that were knee-high that I used to wear.
Hi.
With the fringe and everything. It was, so I was a sight to
you
behold.
You were a skate punk spending the night with their Teen Challenge group saying, I want to be on staff.
And so this guy, Rich, was not real enthusiastic about this.
Yeah.
So he said, what are you doing here? I said, I've come to serve the Lord in Chicago with Chicago Outreach. He said, we had no idea you were coming. I said, well, I filled out my application. I never heard back from you guys. And he was visibly angry. Ooh. Not a good start for me, And he said, well, you can't just show up like this. I said, well, I really felt called by God, and since I didn't hear from you guys, I just thought I would.
Yeah.
So I'm here no matter what. And if it's not this, I'll find something else to do for the Lord in Chicago. I believe I'm supposed to be here. And he stomped out of the room. He was so upset. He stomped out of the room, and I just sat there going, well, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And a few minutes later, he came back holding an envelope, unopened, and it was my application, lost in a pile of unopened mail.
Okay.
And he didn't even open it. His countenance had changed. He was a little more humble, and I could see that it was my application.
Yeah.
And he says, I guess you are coming to Chicago Outreach. So he said, I'm gonna give you some directions and send you to a church. And when you get there, I'll let them know you're coming, and they'll take care of you from here. So that's how that all began. And it was a church plant downtown Chicago. So unbeknownst to me, while I was driving 45 minutes to downtown, Rich calls the pastor of this church. His name's Aaron. And he says, Aaron, I'm sending you a guy who's going to work with your church for this summer for Chicago Outreach. And Aaron said, no. We did that last year. It didn't go so well. We don't want anybody this summer. And he says, well, it's too bad. He's already on his way. And it's like, don't do this to me, Rich. You can't just dump a kid on me. So once again, that's what I'm heading towards. So they got off the phone, and I heard about this story later, but Aaron was upset, very upset.
The pastor at the church.
The pastor of the church. He did not want this kid from Oregon who just, showed
walked
up.
out the street.
Yeah, he's like, we don't want to babysit this kid for the summer. Well, while he was fuming about that, another call came in for him from a former associate pastor of his. And this man could tell that Aaron was upset. He said, what are you upset about? So he explained it. And he says, is the young man's name Phillip? And of course, the room probably got silent at that point. He says, it is. How did you know that? He says, because I met him. I was speaking at a camp in spring.
Oh my goodness.
And I told him about Chicago Outreach, and I told him he needed to come and be a part of it. So it was this guy Dean that I had met who had been the former pastor or associate pastor with Pastor Aaron.
Yeah.
And he told Aaron, says, Aaron, this kid loves the Lord, and he's going to be a real benefit to have him at your church for this summer. You should be excited about it. And he did. He got excited. So that by the time I arrived at that church downtown, I was welcomed with open arms and genuine enthusiasm.
Man.
And I walked in and met their secretary, who would someday become my lovely wife.
Oh, another win.
Yeah. So it was a bonus all over,
Great.
I had nothing to offer to the Lord or to the kingdom except a willingness to say yes and to obey. And I began to see him orchestrate things in my life. And that was these were good experiences as a young believer. I'm 18 years old at the time.
Yeah.
And that's building a foundation for the rest of my life and ministry.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us about what happened through that summer, and then you mentioned meeting Mary, who would later become your wife. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, well, the summer program was fantastic. It was everything that Dean said it would be. It gave me a broad exposure to the city, both helping with outreaches in the projects, Cabrini Green, the Robert Taylor homes, various other neighborhoods, interacting with other churches and young people. And at the end of the summer, we had such a great relationship, myself and the church, that Pastor Aaron hired me. I got my first staff position as a custodian.
I was
the church janitor.
Nice.
And I was so excited to be in full-time ministry as a janitor of the church.
That's awesome.
We also, our church back in 1990 built one of the first skateboard ministries in the country.
Wow.
And we built a small skate park in the basement of the church, and we called it Skate Church. And so for the next year, we would open our doors every Friday night to about 100 skateboarders who would come in and they had to come to a church service that we held. And then we'd let them skate for the rest of the night.
Yeah.
And that's where I also began to get in front of people a little bit. I was always afraid of speaking publicly, but the youth pastor, whose name was Dirk, he would have me do the announcements every week. And I'm 18. These are a bunch of skateboarders. It shouldn't be a big deal. But I used to be terrified to even get up in front of them and give the weekly announcements.
Yeah.
But that's how I also began seeing how God can use unique ways to minister to people.
Yeah.
And we saw some genuine fruit from that. It was having an impact on the skateboarders.
That's awesome. So tell us about your relationship with Mary then.
Yeah, well, we worked together for the next year, and I remember once saying a prayer, Lord, I don't know who you have planned for my future for a spouse, but if I could put in a request, I would love for it to be someone like Mary, the secretary. At the time, I didn't think I had any chance, no shot at me. She was single, but all the guys in the church, were probably aspiring to her.
Yeah.
And
you were just the church janitor.
And I was just the janitor. There's no chance. But I did at least put on my request to the Lord and said, I really think her character and her personality is the type of person I would like to marry.
Yeah.
So God answered that prayer better than I gave it. So
yeah.
So we fell in love and got married. We'll be celebrating 27 years of marriage in a couple weeks.
That's awesome. I know from, knowing you over the last several years, media is something that you talk about a lot. In fact, you have an organization that you founded and you're the president of called Media Talk 101. Can you tell us about how did that come to be and what the ministry is?
Sure. Back in 1998, Mary and I moved from Chicago out to rural Illinois, a little town called Mount Carroll. And I served as a youth pastor. And I was expecting to be a pastor to Opie in Mayberry.
Okay.
This is a town of 1,700 people, rural Illinois,
agricultural,
cornfields, soybean fields, dairy farms. That's, so certainly this has got to be a cush job,
Oh, yeah.
And yet one of the big shockers for me moving out of Chicago was to see that the kids in that rural area they were struggling with everything that the kids in the inner city were struggling with, except for gang activity. That was the one thing that was different. There was no gang activity. And I began to contemplate that, going, what in the world? How can you come out to this rural community and see all these problems going on with drugs and broken homes and unwanted pregnancies and suicides? and violence, and it was
And this is a town of 1,700 people.
1,700 people, not even a stoplight in town. One
Wow.
stoplight in the whole county, but that wasn't in our town. And I realized at that point the power of media and entertainment, that wherever you had computer access, radio, the things that built culture, were in the country as much as they were in the inner city. And that's really what provoked me to start thinking deeply about the effects of media and entertainment, and also to try to find ways to help young people. So that's when I was inspired to start Media Talk 101 with the thought of a nonprofit that would exist to help teach. Initially it was students, but then it broadened into reaching out to parents and teachers and pastors and leaders.
Yeah.
So I established that in 2005.
2005. And tell us, what is the main premise of Media Talk 101? You already alluded to a little bit, but
we have a tagline, teaching media discernment in the light of following Christ. And it really, essentially, as a Christian, how does discernment when it comes to media play that role, positive and negative, in our life? We can't live a compartmentalized life saying, well, I'm going to follow Jesus, but I'm not going to be concerned about what I'm listening to, what I'm watching. Those things do affect me, for good or for bad, and I need to understand those. So I really wanted to help people to have a biblical worldview on media and entertainment, to see that not all entertainment's bad, but it's not all good either.
2005, you launched Media Talk 101. You also wrote a book at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us forward through time. What are the other things that the ministry has now begun to do?
Well, when I began to speak on the subject, I was determined not to do that without taking my family along. Family is very important to me. And being a husband and a father, I didn't want ministry to come first. So I made a choice, which was a sacrifice for our family and for the ministry, but it was more of a benefit for the family than it was the ministry, and that was I bought an RV. And I traveled with my family. So for nearly 10 years, we traveled about 6 months out of the year.
Wow. And
then we'd be home, and back out on the road. Really just finding anywhere I could to communicate with people.
Got it. And then take us forward from that point.
The next big change happened here in San Antonio. We moved from Illinois to San Antonio in 2006. And as a newbie to San Antonio, I met the leader of an organization who was running a film festival, and learned about our ministry and invited me to attend. Now, I had no interest in creating film, but I'm new in the community and I get invited to an event. Why not? I was introduced to Stephen Kendrick, who was one of the speakers, and some of the things he shared really made me start thinking about the power of film and how it should be integrated into ministry. I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet, but it definitely planted those seeds. And in a conversation I had with Stephen in the hallway that year, he really encouraged me to think about documentary and the power of documentary for a ministry like ours. It would be a couple years later before I really decided to go that direction, but that's what happened. And so in 2011, I set out to spend the whole year creating a documentary called Captivated, Finding Freedom in a Media Captive Culture. And we released it in December of that year, 2011. And that really had a huge impact in our ministry of Media Talk 101, because where I couldn't be everywhere at once, the documentary was going all around the world. I had no idea I was hoping it would spread throughout the U.S., but I had no idea at the time that it was actually going to spread globally.
Wow. Can you tell us a little about the impact that documentary Captivated has had?
It's been used in China by teachers wanting to reach people.
Yeah.
It's been translated into Russian. It's been dubbed into Russian for Russian satellite broadcast. It's of course we have Spanish subtitles, and it's been spreading through Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries. A neat thing, I was speaking at a conference about a year ago, and a young couple came up to me. I didn't recognize them, but the young lady used to be part of my youth group when I was a youth pastor.
Oh, wow.
Now she was, married woman with children, and she shared her testimony, and she said, my husband and I really had a problem with our entertainment choices and media choices, and someone gave us your documentary, Captivated, and we watched it like, hey, this is my former youth pastor made this.
Wow.
And she says, we got so convicted, we really decided to really clean house and make big major changes, and we are so grateful. It's made such a difference in our marriage, and now as new parents, and even in our ministry. So thank you for making that documentary. I'm like, wow, who would have known?
Let's transition. Tell us about, there's a huge project that you work with now currently called the Christian Worldview Film Festival. Why don't you tell us how that came to be and your role with that?
Well, when I was becoming more interested in documentary, I began being a better student and putting myself around other Christian filmmakers. That's how we met.
Right.
That's
right.
And I began to meet other Christian filmmakers, and that's a small little subculture of Christianity.
Yeah.
So once you dip your toes into those waters, you begin to make friends.
Yeah.
And you begin to enter into a whole new world. And that world was one I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed being around content creators and people enthusiastic about film. I felt it was very beneficial to our ministry, which sometimes gets the bad rap of being anti-media and anti-technology, which we're not, but sometimes that's people's perception.
Right.
So being around content creators was really important. And through the process of making the documentary, that put me more into the stream of that world of independent Christian filmmaking, collaborating with other people, working with other people from the production side, pre-production, production, post-production, as well as distribution, and learning from others. So that became part of our new community, were the content creators. And then in 2013, I continued to produce short projects, whether they were promotionals or short films, and just be engaged in the community. And many of us were gearing up for another festival in San Antonio in 2014, when we all got an announcement that particular festival had come to a close.
Right.
Abruptly. Many of us had projects. Now, I had a couple short film projects I was going to be entering, but I had friends that had been working on projects for a year or 2 years, and everybody was anticipating this event. And it was such a communal letdown. There was a communal groan that just kind of went through the filmmaking community. And as a pastor, because I've got a pastor's heart, and this was part of my community, I really felt a burden for the filmmakers.
And just to clarify, this was not just a Christian film festival. This was a very significant...
One of the most significant Christian film festivals in the country.
I mean, it's gotten a lot of us, like you and myself, kind of involved in filmmaking from the get-go.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was a big letdown. And I began to inquire. I began to ask other people, is anybody going to try to do something? Try to, even just for this year, do something to help the filmmakers. They've got projects. They were anticipating a festival, and nobody that I talked to really had any vision for that. And I felt differently. So I began to talk with my wife and then the other pastors at our church and my board of directors, and asked them, I said, do you think that we should run a film festival, at least this year, just to help out while there's this big letdown? How hard can it be, to rent a venue, get some films, invite people to come watch them.
Yeah.
Boy, was I naive. It was a good thing. I didn't know what I was getting into. I might not have gotten into it.
Yeah.
So not many months later, we had our first event held in San Antonio. We had 700 people attend. We had 100 films that had been submitted. They were films that were ready to submit to the other festival, so they submitted to ours, and we invited people to come watch them. We gave out some modest awards, but most importantly, we wanted to honor the Lord and encourage this community to keep their eyes focused on Jesus and keep making media that honors Him and impacts the world. We have half the week is what we call the Filmmakers Guild, where we invite people in the industry, as well as people who can speak to the subject of worldview, to come in and give workshops and keynote sessions. And that's really the heart of what we're doing. that's that teaching component. We wanted filmmakers to both have some practical things that would apply to the craft of filmmaking, but we also want to encourage them in their walk with the Lord. So we have the first 3 days of a week-long event just dedicated to training and worldview talks.
Yeah. So I know that during this adventure with Media Talk 101, you also became a co-pastor at Living Water Fellowship in Bulverde, Texas. How did the church respond to you starting a film festival?
They were so supportive, and they became our volunteer base, and I'm so glad to have the congregation that we have. It just stepped up and really made this. It didn't create a wedge between myself as the pastor and the church. It actually helped us grow closer together in that first year to actually have something we were doing together.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of the Christian Worldview Film Festival, which now we've just celebrated our 5th annual event in Franklin, Tennessee in March of 2018.
Phillip, it has been such a joy and a privilege to get to talk to you and to hear your story and to hear the testimony of God just working through your life. And I know that I've been really encouraged just hearing that. I'm sure our listeners will be also. If there's one last thing that you could just leave with listeners to talk about or to think about, whether it be about media choices or something else in your heart, what would you have to say?
The most important thing goes back to this idea that we don't belong to ourselves. We're told that we've been bought with a price.
Yeah.
Many of us don't live that way. But there's hardly a day where I don't reflect back on what it was like to live a life without God, without Christ, and the joy of serving Him. And I wish more people would consider the joy and the real life that they could find by simply turning their hearts over to Him and saying, you be in control of my life, not me.
Yeah. You've been listening to Phillip Telfer on Compelled. It's been a joy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
What a blessing to hear how God changed someone's life at the very moment they planned to take it. Philip's testimony really illustrates how God is never hindered by our own weakness, but rather delights to use our willing hearts regardless of their background. You can learn more about Phillip at his website, philliptelfer.com. You can also visit our website, compelledpodcast.com, and search for this episode. There, we'll include links to Phillip's church, Media Talk 101, the Christian Worldview Film Festival, his documentary Captivated, books he's written, songs he's written, and so much more. And we've uploaded a photo that Phillip sent us of what he looked like back when he was a hardcore BMX rider. He's got this crazy long hair, a leather jacket. It's the whole 9 yards. Plus, there's also a more recent video of him doing tricks on his BMX bike, including surfing on his bike. Seriously, you've got to watch this. Also, Phillip has graciously donated a free copy of his book, Media Choices, and his DVD, Captivated, which we'll be giving away for free this week to a certain somebody. To get your chance at winning a copy, head over to our Facebook page and leave a comment on the post about this episode, or even better, share the Facebook post with your friends or both, and you'll be entered into a free drawing. And then at the end of this week, we'll choose a random 2 winners to get one. We'll get a copy of the book, one will get a copy of the DVD. You can find links to all of this at our website, compelledpodcast.com. You can also find our other episodes by visiting our website or by subscribing to Compelled on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, and many other podcast platforms. Episodes are released every Tuesday. Thanks again to everyone who has shared our podcast and our stories ever since we launched just 2 weeks ago. Thanks also to all of you who've left reviews or 5-star ratings wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate it. Our show was edited by Zach Fowler, who is a gifted film editor, visual effects artist, and storyteller. You can find Zach and his work at zachfowlerimagery.com. Our logo was designed by Josiah Jost, an incredibly talented logo designer. You can reach Josiah and view his work at siadesign.com. Also, congratulations to Josiah and his wife on the birth of their new baby. Our website was created by Ben Billups, a digital developer extraordinaire. You can follow Ben on Instagram at ben.billups. Special thanks to my wife, Sarah Hastings, for helping make this project a reality. Without her, this podcast wouldn't exist. And that's it for this episode. Stick around after the music for a sneak peek at our next episode. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll see you again next Tuesday.
What happened with me was I got to the very top of my world. I'm getting ready to start a right guard. I'm getting ready to make, in today's dollars, about $600,000 in 6 months. And yet even football was empty. And that's when, I got hit in the face.